Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to hand on and introduce Catherine Patterson from Carbon Positive Australia. So in the Tweed, our average carbon footprint per person is 9 tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions each year. As part of the global effort to halt average temperature rise, we're all going to need to halve that to meet the global temperature targets. So one of the first steps is to understand where are our greenhouse gas emissions coming from. Calculating our carbon emissions footprint is the first step in describing the size of your footprint and where your best bet is in terms of impacting that to reduce it. So Catherine's here to step us through that process and to explain more about carbon offsets. Fabulous, Catherine. I'm really interested in this one. Catherine's the head of partnerships at Carbon Positive Australia, where she's worked for 5 years. She's recently qualified as an Al Gore climate reality leader. Her favourite green initiatives outside of work are her vegetable garden and local conservation work. And after 3 years of trying, she has finally nailed composting and worm farming. Congratulations, Catherine, and please welcome.
Carbon Positive Australia is a WA-based not-for-profit organisation. We've been around since 2001. We came to be to utilise the carbon market to plant more trees and restore more land. And that is what we are still doing. To date, we've planted almost 6 million trees across Australia, over 5,000 hectares. However, we have a broader mission, and that is to assist the Australian community to reduce their emissions, and we do this through education. We want to help Australians to understand their carbon footprint. Thank you for joining me today. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. To get things going, we're going to get the terminology out of the way. Carbon offset and carbon credits. The terms are interchangeable, and it means you are paying for carbon to be removed elsewhere in the economy. This is done through either reduction or removal. Removal means stopping carbon going into the atmosphere. An example of a removal project would be renewable energy. Reduction is reducing the emissions in the atmosphere. At the moment, only nature-based solutions do this, trees and blue carbon. Carbon neutrality, this is a state of zero emissions. Practically everything we do creates emissions, some activities more than others. Reduction is always the first step, but there will always be unavoidable emissions. Carbon offsetting allows us to get to zero. We recently had a change of name to Carbon Positive. And to illustrate positivity, we have a picture of my kids planting trees at one of our plantings, which is a positive image if you know my kids. But what does carbon positive mean? There definitely can be some confusion on this term, as it can mean the opposite of carbon negative. But increasingly, it's being used to mean going beyond carbon neutral, giving back more than we take, and developing ongoing sustainable systems. Preserving and restoring native environments are key to this. We get asked this question a lot. How many trees does it take to offset 1 tonne? The answer, of course, is it varies, because the bigger the tree, the more carbon it captures. However, this is a little bit simplistic, as planting big trees does not always result in the best environmental outcomes. Planting the wrong species can do more damage than good to local ecosystems. We always endeavour to plant in harmony with the local environment by collecting seed from local species. Often where we plant, it's a fairly dry country, as we're sort of planting in sort of regional wheatland areas. Often our plantings have relatively low carbon yields in comparison to monocultures, but they deliver many more benefits, such as increased habitat for local species, improved biodiversity, better soil health, and protection against growing salinity. However, unlike carbon, a lot of these qualities don't have a quantifiable economic or material benefit yet. So let's start to move on about how you can make an impact on your footprint. Like good financial management or a great diet plan, better results are achieved if you understand what approach is going to be most effective for you. Getting to know and understand your carbon or ecological footprint is a really useful place to start, as you know which activities to address first. This slide shows which activities generally generate the most emissions to the average Aussie's footprint. Aussies have one of the highest carbon footprints per capita in the world, averaging 15 tonnes per person per annum, when the global average is less than half of this. And some say for a sustainable future, we need to get to 3 tonnes per capita per year. So we have a lot of work to do. And for part 2 of my presentation, I'll be doing a demonstration of using our carbon calculator. I just wanted to say a new version is on its way in the new year, thanks to grant funding and some awesome developers. The user experience is being adapted to assist first-time users on their journey. To calculate your carbon footprint accurately, you need the data. This is why carbon calculation should be done retrospectively. The first step is to collect the data, get your bills and other records. The time period is up to you. It's also up to you to decide which activities you want to measure. It's always better to start small and to build on it. I only look at my electricity, gas, flights, vehicle and waste. I also calculate annually because I find the data points much easier to collect. So here we have my electricity bill. We have solar in our house, so I'm only going to offset the balance of what we use versus what we export into the grid. So I'm taking the difference between used and exported, which will be 209. I'm going to multiply that by 4 to get my annual total. This is because I don't have my other bills here, and I also know that this is my highest consumption rate during the winter because we're not utilising as much solar. Your gas is very similar. You want to get the energy units used on your bill, or alternatively megajoules if you're over east. So I've got that data now, so I want to go into the carbon calculator. And here we have our current carbon calculator. So I'm going to skip down to electricity, and I'm going to input the amount of kilowatts I know I've used, which is 836 for the year. And I'm going to add it to my electricity. And there we have the total. And then I'm going to skip down to add my gas. In my state, it's in kilowatt hours. I'm in Western Australian Metro, and I know my consumption is 240.68. Again, all I did was multiply the total on my bill by 4 to get my annual emissions. I'm going to add that to my gas. Next, I'm going to do my annual vehicle. I don't know how many kilometres I've travelled, so I'm going to take the Australian average, although I know I'm much below this. I do know my vehicle type, so I'm going to select that. If you know the information, you can click on advance and you can add the distance you've travelled or how much fuel you've consumed. But as I said, don't know that, so I'm just going to select this and add this to my vehicles. Next, I'm going to add my waste. Waste can be a little bit complicated, so I'm going to give you a demo of how you would work it out. Now, here in our advanced tab, it says the average Australian bin holds 240 litres, and this is it in volume. So I'm going to take that. Now what I'm going to do is I am going to do this calculation. So I'm using an average bin, which is 240 litres, and this is its volume. Each week, it's a quarter full, and it gets collected weekly. So obviously I'm going to take the volume, times it by the number of weeks in the year, and divide it by 4 to get my volume. And this is a figure that I want to put in to the carbon calculator. Back I go. 3.212, and my waste type, again, this is a little bit confusing, but you want to get your commingled waste because that's just general waste. I'm going to add that. Go. And so here I have, well, an element of my carbon footprint for the year. So I can save this on our carbon calculator. You can save this so you can use it another time, or you can go on and offset 2020 emissions. I probably didn't spell that properly. Okay, and save. And this will save and offset. And here we go. So here I can see the percentage of my carbon footprint. So I guess as I run through the process, you can probably see that there are limitations to the carbon calculator. They can only calculate what can accurately be measured. Electricity and fuel consumption are easy as we have the data, but it's harder to get the measurements if there are a lot of variables. Obviously, higher consumption creates higher emissions, but because there are a lot of variables, it's hard to calculate this on an individual level. So I'm just going to jump into this slide. This is where it's quite useful to see the greenhouse emissions by sector, as it shows which activities in the economy create the most emissions. So when you buy or purchase something and you think about what goes into getting it into your home, you can get an idea if it has a large or a small carbon footprint. For example, if you buy a bottle of wine from overseas, that glass bottle full of liquids has to be transported. So it will have a much higher footprint than your local plonk. To wrap up this presentation, I just wanted to give you my top tips on reducing your carbon footprint. Firstly, preserve and protect our native environments. Land clearing and deforestation are major contributors to climate change. How you can help is to look at your own supply chain and make sure the companies that you purchase from have a policy on this. And of course, you can support rehabilitation programs. And the other two hopefully don't need as much explaining. Buy less and buy local. By doing this, you are massively decreasing the carbon footprint of products that are in your home. And thirdly, the top tip for you to do individually is minimize your travel.
So I'd like to ask one, when people in Tweed buy carbon offsets, are they supporting local replanting projects?
Yes, they are. We, so as I sort of mentioned earlier in the presentation, we are WA based, but we do a lot of plantings in WA, but we are also always looking for the right type of plantings over east. And this year we're doing a 30-hectare restoration around Nimbin. Sorry, not this year, it's going to be in 2021. There's always a bit of a lead time in starting a project. Like we'd be starting to do seed collection now. So, and I guess we are actively trying to find landowners that want to work in collaboration with us over east, if on cleared land that they want to restore. So yes, yes, definitely we've got a project over east, and I think we've got a few more on the horizon.
Fabulous. And how soon do replanting projects start drawing down carbon emissions?
Yeah, good question. I guess, so trees, it's normally in about the first, I don't know if I can answer that exactly, but trees basically draw down the most carbon in about the first 30 years of their life. About half the trees' biomass is carbon. So obviously trees, when they're grown, they've got carbon stored in them, and different species draw down different amounts. That's why it's quite difficult to answer that question. And different methodologies specify different carbon crediting periods. And carbon crediting periods means the time that they're going to draw down carbon. So that's set out in the methodology, but it's not, I guess the actuality, once.
Exact, yeah.
Yes. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, no, that's good. And Scott's put a question. He's just said, thanks for a great presentation, Catherine. Is there a good range of options to offset household carbon emissions?
Yes. I think, like I said earlier in my presentation, it depends what you want to support through your carbon offset. So cheaper offsets tend to be like renewables. Or if, I guess what I'm trying to encourage people to do is, if you want to sort of double the impact, I'd be doing it through a nature-based offset, such as something we do, which is sort of reforestation, and planting native habitats. So I would
So are
encourage.
we better, just to lead on from that then, are we better to contribute to a larger scale project than to try to do sort of little tiny things locally on our own properties? Is that?
That's, I mean, it's sort of a good question. It's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
I think it's really important to take personal actions and do all we can, but definitely large scale restoration. I mean, obviously not cutting down the trees in the first place is really important, but I think restoring those large corridors of native habitat is really, really important. It's going to deliver, enormous benefits, not just in carbon, but into ecological restoration as well, and to our natural wildlife.
Yeah, and I guess I had another question, I've forgotten it. Do we have any more questions? Help me out here, guys. Add some more questions to the chat box.
I didn't know, because I obviously skipped over it in my presentation, and if no one wants to talk about this, it's fine. I was just actually going to talk a little bit about, food, and as I said, it's quite complicated, the waste issue in your carbon footprint. And I just thought, sometimes it's good to explain why. For these sort of things, it's obviously you can calculate it, but what's actually quite difficult is actually getting the emissions factors, because I know a lot of people sort of say, I'm recycling or I'm composting, which are amazing things to do. We all need to do them. How much does it save? And our calculator does show it. It's just actually one of those areas that is quite complicated. For something like recycling, it's sent overseas, there's a lot of energy put in. So the reason I'm sort of talking about this is it's, as I sort of said before, there's things that is really great to do yourself and measure, but there's also, it's, I guess, sort of looking at the wider picture and how your actions can impact on your carbon footprint as well. Because food is, diet's a huge thing that we can do. I'm not saying to people to be vegetarian, but looking where you source your food, is it local, and what's involved in that process of getting that food to you. Sorry, Scott's just popped in another question.
Is the calculator set up to monitor emissions, add in offsets, and therefore track and report progress over time?
Yes, it is. It's not, sorry, our calculator is something like I know it mentioned before, the Climate Clever calculator. I think it just does electricity, and that has some really good tracking. Our calculator does allow you to save your calculation and access it at different points, so you can see whether you've got better or worse on your energy year on year. So you can go back into it and have a look at it. So I hope that answers your question, Scott.
And Catherine, I'm just going to add to looking at the data that you presented, like it does make me start to question things like transport for myself. If you're thinking about your air transport, I'm sure during COVID we would be smashing that and doing much better because nobody's going anywhere in planes. But
that
even
positive.
even one, aspect in terms of car travel and whether we can transition to more sort of active transport, cycling and walking and so on. And I guess that comes down to the design of our urban areas as well, and making sure that we've got good transport, sort of public transport links, and also safe opportunities for us to do things like ride to work and so on. But it did make me think, wow, there's a whole transport section there that I could certainly do a bit more about.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, you mentioned about air flights. If I was to put in my air flights, like if I was to take a flight, you would have seen my emissions double if that was something I put in, so that's one good thing about COVID, although I'm sure some of us are missing not being able to visit relatives. And
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a trade-off. Yeah, and someone's asked a question, Marilyn's asked a question there about people felling camphor or old trees in Tweed, which are a pest species, because they do take over. Is it better to leave them as they're large trees? I guess they are contributing in terms of carbon. So I get that's a pretty specific one for us, but yeah, this question about weed species versus leaving them from a carbon point of view.
Yeah, I mean, so absolutely right. The carbon, they would be tying up carbon, but they are having other environmental impacts. So, yeah, it's a bit of a hard one. I guess this is where we're sort of saying native environments are really, really important, not just for carbon. Well, you know, they are important for carbon, but many other factors. So I don't know. I couldn't really answer what is the best solution in that case. But I think, you know, it's just a real argument for not interfering, and sometimes planting the wrong trees in the wrong areas can be quite detrimental.